I'm Sheldon McLeod, and this is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you here on the SaltWire Network, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to dig into some of the issues. And I know it's been a few days now since the Mass Casualty Inquiry released its report. It was given a very broad mandate to talk about a lot of things, and I've taken some time to talk about some of those here in this space. And I want to take a second to talk about guns and gun control. That was one of the priorities of the MCC, aiming for tougher gun control, as some of the inadequacies laid bare. And I thought it was interesting to note that there were a few folks who were saying the illegal importation or smuggling of guns across the border and how that plays into this conversation. I reached out to a professor who was quoted in that article that was written by my coworker, Chris Lambie. But there was also some help in the form of a referral towards an author of a book, Arms, the Culture and Credo of the Gun. And I wanted to welcome AJ Somerset to the conversation. Good day to you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Hello.
When we talk about gun control in Canada, and I was just noting in the description of your book that you're a former service member, you've talked about taking a break from guns. So how do you describe yourself to people when it comes to this conversation?
Oh, well, nowadays, I guess I would avoid describing myself at all typically, but, nowadays I'm a gun owner, but I'm sort of skeptical of the recent shift in gun culture, and I see things there as problems. And I think we need to be willing to talk about those problems in a sort of frank and honest way.
It's very clear that there are politicians who gain a lot of traction by saying there's no reason for anyone to own a firearm in Canada. And with a population that's primarily or mostly centered in urban locations, it makes sense that that audience would be very receptive to it. Do you bother trying to make an argument as to why or why not when it comes to owning firearms?
Well, I mean, certainly there's reasons to own firearms in Canada. And one of the things I like to say is that if you're going to have a sensible discussion on firearms, you have to be willing to accept two things. One is that there's reasons to want to regulate guns. And the second is there's legitimate reasons that people want to own guns, and there's legitimate uses for guns. And we have to acknowledge both those points. You know, in Canada, we have remote and northern communities. We have Indigenous communities. We have, most people, yes, do live in major cities now, but we have a lot of people who live in the country and who still hunt and so on. And just because somebody lives in the city as well as I do does not mean that they don't also go hunting. So those sort of traditional uses for firearms are very much a thing in Canada. And to say that there's no reason to own a gun in Canada, I think is sort of a blanket statement that says, hey, I live a certain way and I think everybody else in the country should be just like me.
There is a fear, and that's been communicated by advocates who say this is about disarming an entire population. And is that the sense of shift that you're talking about, how it's becoming much more a conversation like what we hear in the United States?
Well, that's part of the shift is that argument that the end game of gun control is to take everybody's guns away. You know, if we go back to in the United States to the Gun Control Act of 1968, we did not hear the NRA saying, hey, everybody's, they're trying to take away everybody's guns. They're trying to take away every gun in the country. That's something that started to come out later in the 1970s. And that argument has become more and more prevalent. And it's a little worrisome that it's becoming so prevalent, because at its core, what it's doing is it's saying that every time there's a move for gun control, it's really a crisis, and your entire sort of way of life, if you identify as a hunter or a gun owner, is under threat because they want to disarm you. And also it connects to some rather kooky conspiracy theories that suggest, why they want to disarm you. So there's this a sort of apocalyptic tone to this suggestion that they're trying to disarm everyone, and that in itself is kind of worrisome.
I had grown up like you, 14-year-olds out rabbit hunting with a .22, growing up in rural Nova Scotia, and I've found over the last number of years it's very, very difficult to try and defend that position in the context of the hyperbole and the emotions that are attached. And every time that we tend to talk about this, and I think it's very savvy political positioning to make it look like that somehow your willingness to want to accept guns as part of a culture or in a community is somehow a fringe, and it's about propping up or promoting some kind of hateful or dangerous behavior.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays we see in politics in general, we see a lot of polarization. Things are becoming increasingly polarized. And in the gun world, this is certainly true. And one of the things that tends to happen is we start to see people as caricatures. So we have our caricature of what the gun owner is and what the gun owner thinks, which is largely based on those people who are most vocal. And the thing we need to remember is there's a relatively small number of gun owners who are actually that vocal about gun politics. We have 2.2 million plus people in this country who own firearms with licenses. And there's fewer than 40,000 who can be motivated to spend less than $50 to join a pro-gun organization. So that tells you just how small that vocal minority is compared to the community as a whole. But that vocal minority are the people we see. And so everybody is assumed to be just like them.
When it came to the most recent government policy or bill legislation to change classifications, to make some weapons illegal, restricted weapons have always had rules around them in Canada, handguns specifically. But I think there's some validity in this discussion that, and I heard Michael Scott, a lawyer for some of the families represented in the Mass Casualty Choir, talk about crime guns, and that the Mass Casualty Commission might have been more clear in some of what they were talking about. Do you feel that this federal government right now has a handle on what it is that they need to be taking more control or ownership over when it comes to making our communities safer?
Well, we get into this, very difficult sort of conversation around crime guns and exactly what it is we're meaning to control. So certainly the majority of gun crimes in this country at the moment are gang related, and the majority involve handguns, but that's not the whole picture. And what's tended to happen is that that majority case of the gang related handgun crime gets treated as the whole gun problem. So we hear people saying, we are not the problem. What is the problem? Is there a single problem? And, the answer is there isn't a single gun problem. There's multiple gun problems. So the federal government, they are passing laws about what they can pass laws about, or attempting to pass laws about what they can pass laws about, which is the legal supply of firearms. So it focuses on lawful gun owners. By definition, if you're doing gun control, you're focusing on the guns that can be controlled. The guns that are coming across the border to gangs can't be controlled in that way. You can't make things more illegaler. So you have to focus on what you can control. But then unfortunately, that leads to the idea that any move that's made on gun control is a persecution of the law-abiding. And it's not always a persecution of the law-abiding. You can have legitimate reasons you want to tweak our gun control laws to make improvements that affect law-abiding people, but it's primarily aimed at misuse of firearms. It's not aimed at taking away people's guns and so on. Unfortunately, with the recent changes that were withdrawn to Bill C-21, the federal government really lost control of the narrative there and created the impression that they were indeed just going after guns for the sake of going after guns. And some people would argue that it's not just the impression, it's a reality. But I mean, they lost control of the entire narrative there.
Do you feel the laws in place in Canada now are strong enough, given that proportion of guns, the relative number of firearms that are in this country are clearly much less than what we see south of the border, but yet most responsible gun owners say, they're fine the way they are. Do you think they need to be changed?
Well, I think that Canada has a good gun control system as it stands. There's all kinds of indications of that. One of my favorite statistics that I ran into doing comparisons of Canadian and American crime statistics is, if you're working a gas station or something in this country and somebody robs you, you're very unlikely to be facing a handgun, versus in the United States where it's going to be almost half the time you're facing a handgun. That's an indication of the effectiveness of our gun control laws. So we do have to bear in mind when we're talking about changes to gun control laws that we have a fundamentally good system. That said, there's no reason we can't also make improvements in that system when we see things that are shortcomings. And also, there are some real concerns beginning to arise because of political extremism, because of the rise of the whole culture around so-called black rifles, things like the AR-15. There are some real concerns about the kinds of guns that people are permitted to own, and whether we can address the problem of mass shootings, make them less frequent and less severe by trying to restrict what people are legally allowed to own.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the Mass Casualty Commission's recommendations and its findings throughout its hearing in regards to the mass casualty, the people who lost their lives here in Nova Scotia.
Well, I think that, there's a lot of recommendations in that report. On the recommendations on guns, I mean, some of them are fairly easy to implement and arguably good. Then we see some that are difficult to implement, such as, the recommendation to ban centerfire long guns with detachable magazines that are semi-automatic. The wording is basically the same as what was in the withdrawn amendment. It's difficult politically to do that right now because that amendment was withdrawn under a lot of pushback. But that at least is doable. Then on the other hand, there are some recommendations in that report that under the current regulatory regime or legal regime are just not doable. You can't do these things. One is making sure, for example, that I can only buy ammunition for the gun I'm licensed for. Well, it doesn't work because we don't license people to own guns. We license people to own guns in general, but not own specific types of guns. Even if we say, okay, we meant handgun ammunition, you can't buy handgun ammunition unless you're licensed to own a handgun. Well, there's rifles that fire pistol caliber ammunition, pistol caliber carbines. So somebody can own one of those without being licensed to own a handgun. So this ammunition rule just doesn't work. Similarly, the idea of collecting firearms from estates, a tremendous burden on firearms officers for a problem that, is arguably probably pretty small. Illegal transfers through estates, I would think, is a pretty small problem compared to, all of the possible firearm problems we can have, and not possible to implement because we don't register long guns. So if I die tomorrow, firearms officer coming in to make sure that all the firearms from my estate are secured, he's got no idea what guns I had in my safe. So the executor of my will could easily divert a firearm if he intended to do so. So, there's recommendations like that are just not in the realm of possibility. But on the other hand, there's many things that actually can be implemented and arguably should.
Are we having a responsible conversation about responsible ownership in this country?
Largely, we're not. I think that the conversation on firearms in this country in terms of politics has largely devolved into a lot of sloganeering, where people are shouting their preferred slogans from each side and throwing things back and forth. So we hear things, from the gun owning side, like, we are not the problem, the government's soft on crime. This is just sloganeering, and it's not a serious attempt to address any problem. It refuses to acknowledge that any problem can exist. Then on the other side, we see a lot of stuff that people just basically say, well, I think we should ban things. I think we should ban everything. I don't see why anybody should own a gun. There's no legitimate reason to own a firearm in this country. That kind of talk. So we're not able to sit down and have a really serious conversation about things that come up that are problems that we discover that could be addressed. Like, well, how what can we do about transfer of firearms from estates, for example? What can we do there that would be practical? We can't have that conversation because it just gets drowned out.
Well, it is a fascinating conversation. And AJ Somerset, any other thoughts before we go? Is there something I didn't ask that I should have?
On the Mass Casualty Commission, not off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. I suppose one point I could make is that with respect to the Mass Casualty Commission, really, I mean, when we talk about gun control recommendations, one of the things to bear in mind as well is that there are a lot of other issues that have come up in those recommendations, and gun control is just a small slice of that sort of overall pie. And certainly the policing problems that were laid bare through that commission, I think, in my view, should be our primary focus at this point. Is we really need to be looking at how the police responded and how to solve these rather clear problems with how the police are operating.
AJ Somerset, thank you very much. I appreciate this.
Right. Thank you.